In the pantheon of World War II history, few names evoke such divided emotions as Captain Herbert Sobel. Immortalized in Stephen Ambrose's book Band of Brothers and the acclaimed HBO miniseries, Sobel is often remembered as the harsh, unpopular commander of Easy Company, the men who became one of the most celebrated units of the 101st Airborne Division. But Sobel's story is far more complex than the villain role he was cast into. He was a man whose brutal training methods helped shape Easy Company into one of the toughest fighting forces in the war, yet his inability to lead in combat cost him his command. His post-war life spiraled into tragedy, ending in loneliness, blindness, and obscurity. This is the real story of Captain Herbert Sobel, the man, the soldier, and the tragic figure whose life was defined as much by his failures as his overlooked contributions. Herbert Maxwell Sobel was born on January 26, 1912, in Chicago, Illinois, to a Jewish family. Growing up in a time when anti-Semitism was pervasive in America, Sobel's background gave him an extra layer of toughness. He attended Culver Military Academy, where he learned discipline, precision, and the basics of military life. Sobel wasn't known as particularly charismatic, but he was diligent, serious, and determined. Later, he studied at the University of Illinois, where he graduated with a degree in business. Before the war, Sobel worked in retail and as a clothing buyer. Ordinary beginnings for a man destined to train one of the most extraordinary units of WWII. USS Maine Mystery 1898, USS Maine 1898, USS Maine, explosion of the USS Maine. What happened to the USS Maine? USS Maine explosion. The story of the USS Maine. The USS Maine. USS Maine wreck. Subscribe for more AI-generated historical war hashtags. US Maine Mystery #1898 Spanish America Navy History Maritime Mystery Military History Shipwreck Investigator Story Unsolved Historical Events 19th Century American History Navy Battleship Explorer Mystery Explorer Thepist. Easy Company began its journey at Camp Toccoa, Georgia. Under Sobel's command, there, recruits faced some of the most brutal training in the U.S. Army. Sobel became infamous for his relentless discipline. Endless runs up Currahee Mountain, 3 miles up, 3 miles down. Forced marches with full packs. Punishments for the smallest infractions. Improperly shined boots. Dirty rifles. Missed salutes. Digging large holes only to fill them back up again. His men despised him. They called him petty, vindictive, and obsessed with breaking them down. He often changed orders mid-task or punished soldiers arbitrarily. Many felt his methods were less about discipline and more about exerting power. Yet, paradoxically, Sobel also pushed himself. Veterans later admitted that anything he ordered, he could do himself. He was fit, determined, and committed to creating a unit that could endure anything. This duality-hated tyrant, but relentless trainer defined his relationship with Easy Company. They would later admit that Sobel's merciless drills hardened them into one of the toughest fighting forces of the war. Despite his effectiveness as a trainer, Sobel's flaws as a battlefield commander became clear. He was terrible at navigation and field tactics, often misreading maps or bungling exercises. Soldiers grew frustrated with his incompetence in maneuvers that could mean life or death in combat. The breaking point came when Sobel tried to court-martial Lieutenant Richard Winters, one of Easy Company's most respected leaders, over a trivial scheduling issue. The men saw this as a power play and rallied behind Winters. Soon after, several non-commissioned officers threatened to resign if Sobel remained their commander. Such an act was unprecedented, a near mutiny in the middle of war preparations. The higher command intervened. Rather than risk losing an elite unit, Sobel was quietly reassigned. He was replaced by Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, and eventually Richard Winters would rise to command Easy Company. Sobel's men felt vindicated. But history would later reveal a bitter irony. It was his very cruelty that forged the toughness which Winters and others would use to lead Easy Company to glory. Despite his effectiveness as a trainer, Sobel's flaws as a battlefield commander became clear. He was terrible at navigation and field tactics, often misreading maps or bungling exercises. Soldiers grew frustrated with his incompetence in maneuvers that could mean life or death in combat. The breaking point came when Sobel tried to court-martial Lieutenant Richard Winters, one of Easy Company's most respected leaders, over a trivial scheduling issue. The men saw this as a power play and rallied behind Winters. Soon after, several non-commissioned officers threatened to resign if Sobel remained their commander. Such an act was unprecedented, a near mutiny in the middle of war preparations. The higher command intervened. Rather than risk losing an elite unit, Sobel was quietly reassigned. He was replaced by Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, and eventually Richard Winters would rise to command Easy Company. Sobel's men felt vindicated. But history would later reveal a bitter irony. It was his very cruelty that forged the toughness which Winters and others would use to lead Easy Company to glory. Under Winters and later leaders, Easy Company became legendary. They parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, fought in Operation Market Garden, survived the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne, liberated concentration camps in Germany. These achievements solidified Easy Company as one of the most famous units in American history. Yet even as his men cursed his memory, some admitted that Sobel's early training was the foundation of their survival. Winters himself credited Sobel for instilling discipline. Others confessed that his impossible standards had bonded them together ironically, often in hatred of him. After the war, Sobel returned to civilian life in Chicago. He worked as a credit manager for a telephone equipment company and married Rose, with whom he had 3 sons. But happiness eluded him. Family accounts suggest tensions at home. His strictness carried into civilian life, straining relationships. Unlike Winters and other Easy Company men, Sobel never attended reunions. He was isolated from the brotherhood he had once trained. Too many veterans. He remained the officer they hated, never forgiven, never welcomed back. The post-war years were cruel to Sobel. His personal life deteriorated. His marriage collapsed. He grew estranged from his sons. By the late 1960s, his situation worsened. In 1970, Sobel attempted suicide. He put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger, but he survived. The bullet destroyed both optic nerves, leaving him completely blind for the next 17 years. Sobel lived in a Veterans Affairs assisted living facility in Waukegan, Illinois, without sight, without close family. He spent his final years in solitude. On September 30th, 1987, Captain Herbert Sobel died alone of malnutrition. At his funeral, no family members attended. His death went almost unnoticed, just a brief obituary. No honors, no speeches. The man who had trained the most famous company in WWII died in silence and obscurity. Today, Sobel's legacy remains controversial. In HBO's Band of Brothers, actor David Schwimmer portrayed him as cruel, incompetent, and hated. Many viewers came away with the impression that Sobel was a villain. Yet the reality is more complicated. The villain, his men despised him, and his failures in leadership justified his removal. He was harsh, vindictive, and often unfair. The trainer, at the same time. Easy Company's veterans later admitted that Sobel's training had saved lives. The tragedy. Sobel's post-war life turned him into a tragic figure, a man who never found redemption, who lived and died in bitterness and isolation. In the end, Captain Sobel was neither hero nor monster. He was a flawed man whose role in history was essential but thankless. The story of Captain Herbert Sobel is one of the most human and heartbreaking in WWII history. He was the man who forged Easy Company but was cast aside before they made history. His men hated him, yet their survival owed something to his discipline. He lived in the shadows of their glory, remembered mostly as the villain of Band of Brothers. And yet, his tragic end reminds us that war does not end when the guns fall silent. For some men, the scars of conflict, personal, emotional, and social, last a lifetime. Herbert Sobel died blind, alone, and uncelebrated. But perhaps his story is worth remembering not for the hate he inspired, but for the complicated truth it reveals, that even the most despised leaders can play a vital role in history.